All right, hello everybody. Today we're going to look at one key event in Germany's expansion, and that is the May 1938, the Sudeten crisis, and of course later on how Germany occupies the rest of Czechoslovakia. Okay, so let's begin. Now, this crisis occurred in May 1938. But before we dive into the crisis, let's get some background information and context. Czechoslovakia, which is this area over here, is an independent state created basically after World War One, and it was created based on lands from Germany, but largely based from lands from the Austrian Hungarian Empire. So after World War One, the Austrian Hungarian Empire collapsed, and the land from the empire was used to create Czechoslovakia. Now, so when you think about Czechoslovakia, basically, really, in some sense, is a multiracial society, and there were many different ethnic groups living in Czechoslovakia. All right. Now, one ethnic group that lived in Czechoslovakia obviously were the German-speaking people, and they were actually located at the Sudetenland, right? So the area that is shaded basically in brown. And these Germans had formerly lived under the Austro-Hungarian Empire, but now they live in the area known as the Sudetenland, which bordered Germany. So around 3.5 million Germans there live there, and they kind of like did not really accept their position in Czechoslovakia because obviously they were German speaking. And so they resented their loss of status and regarded themselves as victims of Czech discrimination. Now, during the Great Depression, they suffered from economic problems, just like how other ethnic groups suffered as well. So there was high unemployment. And because of that, there was a sense of grievance within the community. Now, the leader of the Sudeten Germans, Konrad Heinlein, became, in some sense, the mouthpiece of the Germans who were living there and demanded for self-government away from the Czech government. So, as mentioned again, so this was the area whereby basically a lot of the German-speaking people were quite upset that they were living under the rule of the Czechoslovakia government. Now, 20th May 1938, rumors started circulating that the Germans were making military preparations near the Czech border. And the Czech government ordered partial mobilization, and Britain and France also sent warnings to Germany. And on 28 May 1938, in what was known as Operation Green, Hitler told his generals, "It is my unalterable decision to smash Czechoslovakia by military action in the near future." In other words, he was determined to take Czechoslovakia. Now, at that point in time, basically, the president of Czechoslovakia was this person called Baines. And on 5th September, he actually agreed to all demands of the Sudeten Germans for self-government. However, the leader actually was told by Hitler to reject this offer. And then, at the meantime, the German press started to whip up frenzy of anti-Czech feeling by showing pictures and film footages of, the Sudeten Germans being ill treated. Basically, Hitler was trying to stir up problems. Now, as this was all going on, the big question is how would the international community respond, and especially how would the leaders of the League of Nations, France and Britain, respond? Now, to give some context, France actually had two treaties signed in 24 and 25, which committed France to assist Czechoslovakia in the event of a threat. So by right, the French were supposed to, in some sense, protect the Czechoslovakian people. However, the French people did not want to keep to their treaty obligations. They did not want to wage war. And they were trying to find a solution, a way out of a military showdown with Britain. And of course, they also took leadership from Britain. Okay, so the French, in some sense, were following Britain's lead. What about the British? Now, during that time, the British basically was adopting the policy of appeasement. And many of the politicians, while they had sympathy with Czechoslovakia, the leader, which is the Prime Minister then Chamberlain, did not want or did not believe that it was worth Czechoslovakia was worth fighting for. And of course, he doesn't want to wage a war with Hitler. He had sympathy with the German speaking group there, and he felt that, in some sense, Czechoslovakia was an artificial creation. I mean, it was created after World War One. So maybe Hitler did have some genuine grievances there, and that, the Germans living there basically should have their say, and they should be living possibly under Nazi rule. And so Chamberlain was eager to find a peaceful solution. Was there a way out of this? Can war be avoided? And so basically, Chamberlain is often known as the face of appeasement. And really, appeasement really is this idea of making concessions. Is a diplomatic kind of like a posture. And basically, the whole idea is that we want to avoid conflict. We will give in to the demands of the country. And if you can see in this cartoon over here, really, David Low was quite critical of appeasement, calling the leaders at the time, Britain and France, who were the leaders of the League of Nations, really spineless leaders of democracy. If you can see on this cartoon over here, this is rearmament. This one here is about the Rhineland. So by 36, Hitler had already rearmed, had already basically sent his troops in the Rhineland, and David Low was basically suggesting that if you continue to let Hitler get his way, he will become, if you cannot see the words here, the boss of the universe, and the king, in some sense. All right. Now, but even though David Low was very critical of appeasement, we must try to understand why Britain adopted this policy. And if you turn to page 194 of your textbook, all right, you will see that there are certain reasons why the British adopted the policy of appeasement. The first reason really is looking at British public opinion. Now, at that point in time, many of the British people were anti-war. And basically, because of World War I was supposed to be the war to end all wars, right? And they could not contemplate that, they were going to engage with another war with another country, for example, Germany. And so the British public basically had sympathy in some sense with Germany. And of course, they didn't want another war. And so they didn't want to stand up against Hitler using military force. And it seems to suggest that the demands of the dictators, especially for Hitler, was seen as justified. After all, the Treaty of Versailles was harsh. And many had sympathy about for Germany, that the treaty was too harsh, and that the Germans in Sudetenland were basically trying to get their own self-determination. So this demand seems justified. Moreover, there was a lack of an alternative policy. Now, if let's say we do not support appeasement, then the alternative policy is war. Is there a better policy than appeasement? Because war seems like an option that they did not want to choose. All right. There were also economic pressures. At the time, Britain was still suffering from the effects of the Great Depression. And therefore, because it was suffering from the effects of the Great Depression, it did not devote a lot of its expenditure on military, so-called building and spending. And so really, is Britain therefore ready for war? Not only that, the British had global commitments. The British was at that point in time ruling an empire. Okay, and the question really was that did the other so-called dominions, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, would they support so-called a war, another European war? And actually, they were not supportive. And so the British had to take that into consideration as well. From the British point of view, they also had their defense priorities. And, helping another ally, which is, the Czechoslovakia people or the government, was lowest in their priority. According to them, the British, the first priority is we need to strengthen our so-called air defense. We need to preserve trade routes, which is basically, in some sense, to support the empire. And defending Czechoslovakia against Germany was least of their worries. And of course, we need to consider the impact of Chamberlain. And when we look at Chamberlain, basically, Chamberlain did not like war, okay? And he was determined to resolve international tension through diplomacy and through the use of negotiation. And so, really, because of his personality, a person that desired peace, appeasement seems to be the policy that he would adopt. And so we come to the crisis in 1938. 15 September 1938, the Prime Minister Chamberlain flew to meet Hitler to negotiate. And Hitler initially said that he only was interested in parts of Sudeten. Basically, Hitler was trying to test the waters. Chamberlain thought that Hitler was reasonable. And of course, Hitler now realized that, hey, this is a British politician that I could press further. So a few days later, 22nd September, Hitler then says, oh, I want all of Sudeten. And Hitler claimed that the Czech government was mistreating the Germans in Sudeten. 29 September, Munich Conference, Britain and France, and also Italy then agreed to give Hitler all of Sudeten. And unfortunately, the Czechs and USSR were not consulted. Now, of course, it's sad that the Czechs were not consulted. After all, this was their territory. But the reason why USSR was not consulted is because from the British point of view, and even from Mussolini's point of view, basically they didn't like the communist Stalin. And so why consult them at all? But of course, later on, because Stalin was not consulted, Stalin then became fearful and later on was more willing to sign the Nazi-Soviet pact. Now, what was the plan? Okay, if you turn to page 178 of your textbook, basically there are some things that are listed in the plan. The German occupation of Switzerland would take place by 1st October 1938, and an international commission would determine a provisional new frontier by 10 October. And then an international commission will also supervise plebiscite in areas of disputes. Other parts of the plan includes the Czechs who were living in the area. If they want to leave, they were allowed to leave. And if there are Germans who want to join the Sudeten territories, the Germans were also allowed to join. Okay? And Germany, along with the other powers who signed this treaty, guaranteed the independence of the rest of Czechoslovakia. Now, this is very important. So, because of this agreement, sure, Hitler now has the Sudetenland, but in the agreement, it also says that the rest of Czechoslovakia must be independent. And of course, later on, Hitler would break this so-called agreement. Now, but at the point in time, of course, Chamberlain did not know that Hitler is going to break the agreement. No one knows. I mean, at the point in time, no one can predict the future, though some British politicians like Churchill were very upset over the policy of appeasement. When Chamberlain flew back, of course, he declared that peace had arrived in our time. But this was really quite ironic because 1 year later, World War II will break out. But at that point in time, in 1938, the context, and no one has a crystal ball in some sense, there was really hope that peace had arrived. And basically, the big question was this: was appeasement a mistake? Was it a triumph or was it a sellout? And opinion polls at that time, some of them just suggested that appeasement simply delayed war rather than prevent one. And of course, as historians, now as we look back on this episode, we know in hindsight that war broke out. But at that point in time in 38, okay, where everyone obviously were hopeful, especially for Chamberlain, it is not so easy to say whether or not appeasement was a mistake or not. Though on hindsight now, we can make the argument that it was a mistake. So look at this. You can see photographs of the women, I guess German-speaking women, welcoming the German troops, all right, into the Sudeten. And another picture, this is quite a famous picture, welcoming German troops into Czechoslovakia in October 1938. And sometimes when I look at this photo, I ask myself, I mean, clearly the woman on the extreme left is happy. But what about this woman? Do you think she's happy or is she sad? Or maybe she's so happy that tears are coming down her eyes. How would you know? Okay? How would you know? TOK moment. Anyway, what was the impact of appeasement? Czechoslovakia lost 70% of its heavy industry, a third of its population. But more importantly, it lost its natural mountainous defenses and the man-made fortifications of the Sudeten. And later on, that made it easier for Hitler really to occupy the whole of Czechoslovakia. Hitler saw the Munich Agreement as a stepping stone to the liquidation of the Czech state, right? Now, then we move on to the next event, which came quite fast, a few months later. Now, from early 1939, so after the Munich Agreement, Hitler then starts to encourage the Slovaks to cause disruption and to ask for complete independence. So again, you can see Hitler is testing the waters, okay? Do take note, this is Czechoslovakia. It is made out of different so-called areas, and the Slovaks were living in, obviously, Slovakia, right? Now, Hitler was supported by Father Tiso, who was head of the fascist Slovak People's Party. And the Czech president, okay, obviously was concerned, and he moved his troops into Slovakia to basically crush this agitation. But prompted by Hitler, Tiso then proclaimed full independence of Slovakia and asked for German protection. Now, the Czech president now is very concerned. So basically, he was asked to see Hitler. But unfortunately, that meeting with Hitler was not a good one. And he was forced to sign over Bohemia and Moravia to Hitler. And so, in essence, basically, he was forced to give up Czechoslovakia. And on 15th of March 1939, German troops occupied the rest of Czechoslovakia. 16 March 39, okay, Bohemia and Moravia declared a protectorate of Germany. Okay, so this area over here. And Slovakia was to be an independent state under the protection of Germany. And Ruthenia over here was then occupied by Hungarian troops. Basically, the whole state of Czechoslovakia gone, all right, in 1939. Now, of course, this time round, the British people and Chamberlain watched in horror with the invasion of Czechoslovakia. And now there was a shift in opinion. Because the Munich Agreement in 1938 clearly stated that Czechoslovakia was to be independent. And there was faith and trust placed on this agreement that Hitler would keep to his word. But now Chamberlain was put under pressure to take a firmer stance against Hitler. And on 18 March 1939, Chamberlain told the British cabinet that no reliance could be placed on any of the assurances given by the Nazi leaders anymore. Hitler had broken his promise. Now, therefore, we go back to the debate again. Was appeasement the correct policy? And some historians actually argue that there is something right about appeasement. Okay, and this is what David Dilks, a leading historian, suggests about appeasement. And I like his quote. It says this: appeasement hoped for the best, but prepared for the worst. And David Dilks argues this. When you think of Chamberlain, please do not say that he's a deluded politician, tricked by Hitler. But actually, Chamberlain is quite a complex character with sharp mind. Remember, he desired peace. But when you think about it, which politician doesn't want peace? I mean, if we could take the peace option, we will try to take that peace option first. But he wrestled with doubts. Can I really trust Hitler? Is this man reliable? And he decided, okay, let's trust him first with the Munich Agreement. And he really thought that Hitler's aims were limited, not vast, but limited. And so he wrestled. He decided to give Hitler a chance. He wanted peace rather than war. And I think in some sense, if we can pick peace, we should pick peace first, right? Why should we go to war every time there is a problem? But once Hitler showed through the invasion of Czechoslovakia in 1939 that it was hell-bent on achieving European dominance by force, according to David Dilks, then basically Chamberlain, with a heavy heart, decided to meet force with force. And so as we think about appeasement, maybe appeasement was the correct policy. It gave Chamberlain a chance for peace, to see whether or not Hitler can be trusted. And once Hitler was not trusted, then of course we needed to respond with a firmer stance. All right. And that comes to the next event, which is Poland. But I think I will stop here for today. Please continue to do the MCQ questions in the Microsoft form. And there is kind of like a statement that you need to write about appeasement and Hitler. Please go and think about that argument and complete so-called the form. So thank you, everyone. Have a good day, and also have a wonderful 1st of May holiday. Take care. Bye-bye.